Wir haben innerhalb von 20 Bewerbungen erhalten und heute Vormittag hat der erste Bewerber seinen Arbeitsvertrag unterschrieben, ihn somit Erfolg auf ganzer Linie. Wir können nur sagen, das Handwerk sucht.
Hello again, this is Dr. Mikola Rashik of Neurogenomics making another update video on mRNA vaccines, and today's video is a bit of an addendum to last video, and specifically it will talk about a new theory that's been proposed earlier this year, how SARS-CoV-2 virus could be potentially leading to damage of our DNA, and it completely took me by surprise. It blew my mind, so I wanted to share this with you because it's really interesting hypothesis. And as there is no experiments demonstrated, it's all based on model. We all know from recent history B, if you know what I mean. So let's not jump to any conclusions, but the hypothesis could be contributing to damage of DNA is definitely very interesting. So I want to share that information with you. But first, thank you very much to everyone who has subscribed to the channel. There's been an overwhelming response and support from last video. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. This definitely made things much more exciting and interesting. And thank you to also everyone who disagreed and also did not like the information in that video, for using that channel as a safe space to state your comments and having the courage to say that, especially since the vast majority of those disagreements were voiced in a kind and respectful manner, and this is exactly what we're looking for. It's clearly possible for me to be able to answer all of the questions being posed. So as a response, my marketing director had an idea to start creating a vaccine Q&A session, so we want to be able to give away a whole bunch of free tickets to that. The information on this will be in the description, and stay till the end of the video to find out more how you could be getting the tickets. So now let's go to the study. It's quite complex, so before I explain the hypothesis, let me give you a bit of a background. So recall that DNA is in the nucleus as like a brain of the cell. It tells the cell everything what to do, while the cell relays the information from outside environment into the nucleus. Nucleus will process that information and then it will tell the cell how to respond. So think of the DNA more like a repository of information. So think of it almost like a filing cabinet of information. In order to relay action from inside the nucleus, you need to copy fragments of the DNA. And when you copy those fragments, that's what RNA is. And you produce thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these RNAs all the time. And they have extremely versatile functions, RNAs. Some of them function on their own accord, but some of them act as a template to produce specific proteins. And think of proteins as tiny little molecular robots that end up doing all of the work inside our cells. And such RNAs are called messenger RNAs or mRNA. And that's exactly how vaccines work, because vaccines deliver mRNA information inside our cells. And our cells are not any wiser at that moment where that mRNA came from. They just simply use that template to produce a specific protein, in this case a spike protein, in order to eventually use that protein to stimulate our immune system to respond against spike proteins. So that's the magic behind these new mRNA technology vaccines. But here comes not the mind-blowing part yet. Because we produce so much of these mRNAs inside the nucleus, they have to be taken outside the nucleus inside the cell. That's called cytoplasm, and that's where mRNAs are actually then translated or used as a blueprint to produce those proteins. It's inside the cell, so they have to be transported out. But there's also proteins that are needed to interact with mRNA in order to prevent mRNA from being able to re-interact with the DNA. And why is that important? Apparently, if an RNA were to interact with the DNA in such a way, it could disrupt the system, weaken the system, where it would bind the DNA and potentially lead to breakage of the DNA. So the way that the cell deals with that potential problem is that when an RNA is produced inside a nucleus, before it's transported out, specific proteins bind to that RNA to prevent it from being able to re-interact with our DNA. And the way these proteins achieve that is that they bind to a specific code on the virus, just made out of 4 different chemicals with the arrangement of which and certain proteins will recognize very specific arrangement of these chemicals, these bases, and will bind to the RNA and then prevent it that way from interacting with the DNA, and therefore prevent any potential induction of DNA damage. So that's the background. That's crucial to the story. Now comes the mind-blowing part. And certain proteins will recognize very specific arrangement of these chemicals, these bases, and will bind to the RNA and then interacting with the DNA, and therefore prevent any potential induction of DNA damage. So that's the background. That's crucial to the story. Now comes the mind-blowing part. So how does that relate to the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus? Well, when you're infected with the virus, remember that the virus replicates itself over and over and over. Tons of it are produced, like tons and tons. And also recall that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that genome is made out of RNA. And what these authors basically reminded us is that SARS-CoV-2 RNA virus actually has sequences embedded in it to bind those same proteins that we need inside our nucleus to prevent our own mRNA or RNA from binding back to the DNA. And as a consequence of that, SARS-CoV-2, because it's duplicated inside our cells post-infection to such enormous extent, it can actually start stealing those proteins away. So they are not capable of going back into our nucleus and do their proper function of protecting our DNA from damage. So as a consequence, there's not enough of these proteins inside our nucleus, and the mRNA that we normally would be producing can then re-interact with the DNA and cause its damage, lead to breaks within the DNA, and when that happens, so much damage could potentially occur, so much damage could be introduced that, and here's the wild part as to why authors think the virus might have used this as an evolutionary advantage, is that when you create enough of a damage in a rapid succession in the DNA, the cell will be overwhelmed, cannot fix it, and it will introduce or induce the cell to commit suicide. That's called apoptosis. And the authors posit that perhaps that's a virus's evolutionary trick to induce so much DNA damage so that the cells will die and burst and release everything outside, including the virus. So think of it like a piñata. If you hit a piñata, everything from inside is released, and that's exactly what would happen if a cell is committed to die and commits suicide. It bursts and releases everything. That also includes the release of the DNA material as well, which would then all be cut up, and that might be a trick that the virus uses in order to make it easier for itself to propagate or to spread to and infect other cells. So really, really neat. So it's an indirect way of how a virus could be leading to damage of our DNA. So of course the question is, well, could vaccines be participating in this process? And luckily for us, authors actually did decide to address that topic as well. And remember, again, this is all hypothetical. They're just produced some modeling in terms of measuring the quantities, whether this could be possible in reality or not. We don't know at all if this is real. And they suggested that the mRNA vaccines also have those binding proteins for those nuclear proteins. So if there were enough of them, then perhaps they could be also stealing enough of those proteins to introduce DNA damage as well. But again, that's completely, there's no confirmation from any studies. That's just simply a suggestion. So the answer is we do not know. And remember, spike protein is only a fragment of the full viral genome, so the virus genome would have a lot more binding sites. Nevertheless, spike protein itself is a very large segment of the genome, so the gene that codes for spike protein. So the answer is we don't know, and we should probably figuring that out. So that's the mind-blowing part of how basically virus could indirectly be destroying our DNA to make itself free out of a cell and infect other cells. Now I wanted to bring this back into my own world as well, which is basically medical DNA testing. And I can tell you that when a cell dies and releases its fragmented DNA, just like I've been describing here, we already use this in medicine. So we use this in non-invasive prenatal testing. So that's where you analyze the fragments of DNA released from placental cells to see whether the fetus is developing correctly. We also can use this in cancer. It's called liquid biopsy to see whether, for example, cancer remission might be occurring. And if you're interested about these topics, I present webinars on these every month. But there's so much more information that is emerging, what we can possibly learn from these fragments, and it's absolutely stunning. So, for example, by looking at these fragments of DNA, you can learn about the disease state of an individual. You can learn about which genes are being used by the cell. If you look at the epigenetic information that's encoded on top of those DNA fragments, you could learn which tissues that DNA comes from. So you could actually, in the future, be identifying which tissues are contributing to cancer, for example. And that's not yet used in medicine, but it's just at the frontier of that. So it's likely going to be used in medicine in not too distant future. This is the really, really exciting part. So I wanted to share that information to relay it back into my world that I normally love studying. All right, if you made this far, thank you so much. I wanted to tell you about some of the seminars I'll be presenting. So number one, I'm about to present a seminar that I've been working with a couple colleagues for a very long time. There's 3 experts that are getting together to discuss holistic well-being. So we have a psychologist who will be talking about mental health well-being. We have a financial advisor expert who will be talking about financial well-being, and I'll be the third arm, and I'm talking about the health well-being, as you can learn from medical DNA testing. So if you're in Alberta, email me. I'll send you free tickets for sure. We're just very excited about introducing what we thought would be a very neat program about how can you take care of your well-being in a very broad manner. The other presentation that we're planning to have right away, as what I already mentioned, is the vaccine Q&A. So we're going to basically answer some of the most commonly asked questions as it relates to vaccines, and we're going to open the floor to any other remaining questions that there might be. And I want to give 50 free tickets away. So anyone who subscribes to Maragenomics newsletter will send you a free ticket. So the first 50 people who subscribe, you'll get those free tickets. And if you already recently subscribed and still would want to attend, just email me and we'll send you a free ticket. We just want to have a nice small gathering with safe space. So thank you very much for your time, and if you like this information, again, give us a like, subscribe to the channel. We like it, YouTube likes it, and most importantly, hopefully you like it as well. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Mit dem Hubschrauber zur Eisdiele fliegen, besoffen zur Polizei fahren, in der Lotterie ein Haus gewinnen und bei der ersten Fahrt einen Unfall bauen? Das alles ist im Jahr 2021 genau so passiert. Da sich das Jahr dem Ende zuneigt, möchte ich bei Wissen for Free mit euch auf 2021 zurückblicken. Dafür gibt es heute einen verrückten Jahresrückblick mit kuriosen Schlagzeilen aus der ganzen Welt. Januar. In Oregon in den USA kam es im Januar zu einer ganz absurden Situation. Denn ein Mann klaute ein Auto, ohne zu bemerken, dass auf dem Rücksitz noch ein 4-jähriger Junge saß. Als der Mann das Kind bemerkte:
Hey there, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. I am Alicia, your host, and today I wanted to be as transparent as possible with how I go about structuring my students' first year of learning piano. So I'll translate this for both kids and adults because I find some of you who are maybe watching this video are interested on both sides, either as a parent or as someone who yourself is learning how to play the piano. Thinking about curriculum and structure and how to kind of approach those really important first years of learning music, especially the first year, is something that I've experimented with a lot and played around with a lot. So I wanted to basically just share how I would structure that first year of learning as an adult student and tie in some concepts as we go. I also just wanted to let you know that it is March 30th, which means this is the last date to sign up for my beginner program. We've already had a lot of people sign up, and it's only going to be available for a few more hours. So if you are a beginner and you do want help with this sort of structured approach that I'll be sharing with you a little bit today, then definitely check out the link below, because that is going to be disappearing soon. I'm not going to be opening up another class until, another beginner class until at least September. So hop on board if that's up your alley. But anyway, let's get started. For starters, I want to explain a little bit about the musical levels and how they work. Now, not everyone uses musical levels, but I like to use them because it gives me a sense of something to aim for. It gives a sense of stepwise progression. So there are several major schools that I've done videos on, so you can check them out. But I've done a video on the Royal Conservatory of Music, the RCM. I've done a video on the ABRSM. I've done a video on Trinity College London, and I've also talked about AMEB, so AMEB, the Australian Music School. All of these music schools are basically big institutions that mandate not necessarily a curriculum, but they give classifications for different grade levels. So if you've ever heard someone say, I have my grade 6 in music, that's what they're kind of talking about. Each school is kind of similar. I mean, there's differences between the two. So for example, the RCM has, it goes up to grade 10, whereas the other music schools only go up to grade 8 before they go into diploma level stuff. But the reason that I really like working around these music schools or using them as inspiration is because there are really, really smart people who have been, dedicating their lives to the study of music and developing curricula and developing, grading and rating pieces and their difficulty levels and things like that. That is way beyond the scope of anything I would be able to do myself as one individual human. But what I can do is I can take what they have created. So I can take their resources and pieces that they list at each grade level, and I can use that and apply it to my own method of teaching and my own curriculum. So the way that I do this, and one thing that's unique to the RCM over the ABRSM or the other schools is that the RCM specifically has a preparatory program. Because when you start grade 1 music, it's not the very beginning of your music in school. Start at grade 1, but it's maybe it's kind of a similar grade 1. Already is you have a grasp. One assumes that all patient confidently, you are comfortable in a variety of scales and chords and things like that. So you can't just necessarily show up at grade 1 and start from scratch. The scratch happens before grade 1. So in the first year of teaching, I like to divide that first year into 2 sections. So the RCM divides it as preparatory A and preparatory B to work within that. So in the first year, I like to divide between these 2 categories. Basically, it's like kindergarten part 1, kindergarten part 2. If you want to use that language, you could also. I know some people chafe at that kind of language, but I think it's kind of fun. It's kind of a fun way to remember our own educational journeys and being in the beginner mind of going to school and stuff. I just think that's kind of a fun classification. But the way that I structure this is that in the first 20 weeks, we a lot of ground. We learn all the main basic rhythms, so quarter notes, half notes, whole notes, We even go so far as to learn dotted quarter notes and eighth notes. We even dabble a little bit with triplets, and we do some of the common time signatures. So we'll do 4/4, 3/4, 2/4 time, and we'll also do 6/8 time. So from a notation standpoint, we get comfortable. We kind of started in hand positions and in scales, but I like to get my students out of hand positions really quickly. So one thing with method books, if you've worked with either Alfred's or Piano Adventures, Alfred's especially likes to really keep you in a 5-finger hand position, which is good because it allows you to play music more easily, but it's not very helpful because it's not really like a real world approach. Like anytime you learn this, it's not going to be in a 5-finger position. Your hand's going to be moving around quite a bit. So that's something I really put a precedence on exploring in the early days, just making sure you're not spending too much time locked in these 5-finger positions, because it's not really going to prepare you that well for more complex music. I mean, to give Alfred some credit, it kind of only keeps you in hand positions for a little while, and then eventually the pieces start growing out of that. Other things I like to teach in the first 20 weeks would be we start getting into 5-finger scales in a few different keys. So I like to look at the main keys. So C major, G major, D major, F major. Also a little bit of minor keys. So we'll do A minor and E minor, and a couple full scales. So the full scales that I like to do in the first 20 weeks somewhat depends on the student, but usually C major scale and A minor scale at the very least we'll try, because those ones don't really have any sharps or flats to worry about. In the preparatory B stage, so the second half of the year, we get a little bit more detailed into rhythms, so we'll look at maybe more unusual time signatures, but we'll still kind of stick to the basics. But you'll see something like 3/8 time, you'll see 16th notes come about, and syncopation is something that I like to touch on as well, because one thing I find, there's a lot of really cool grade 1 music. So for example, I love Christopher Norton. I think his books, which are ordered by level, so he has connections 1, connections 2, that corresponds with grade 1, grade 2, and all the way up to 8. They're these really cool modern sounding pieces. So it's very much a graded approach. Like if you go through his books, they are progressively getting difficult in line with the grades, but they're more modern sounding. So he does a lot of blues and jazz and
Сегодня я покажу вам, сколько получилось сэкономить на покупках онлайн с расширением bikers.com. Первый шаг. Мы загружаем расширение для браузера bikers.com и добавляем в корзину выбранный вами
other dance styles and things like that, just more modern sounding pieces as opposed to classical. They're really fun pieces to learn. However, it's a really big jump to go from say the first 2 method books like Alfred 1 or Alfred 2, Piano Adventures Adults 1 and 2, into Christopher Norton book, because the rhythms can be pretty complex. So I often find there's like a big kind of jarring moment when my students transition from the method books into more challenging pop pieces that are still at a grade 1 level. So what I've done more recently in my teaching is start looking at learning a little bit about blues, learning a little bit about syncopation, and more complex rhythms in that first year, just to kind of smooth the transition into the grade 1 material. So another thing that I do in the first year is, one way you can think of this, if you're separating it in 2 parts, say you're using the Alfred method books, I would do this book in the first half of the year. So this is the basic piano course, book 1. For adults, I would do this in the first half of the year, and then book 2 in the second half of the year. So you'd go through 2 method books in a year. Really fast pacing, but that's been what I've noticed gets pretty good results. You would follow the same approach if you were using Piano Adventures. So they're adults Piano Adventures 1 book I'd use in the first half, and then the 2 book I would use in the second half of the year. This does require, especially because I tend to assign supplemental material as well, kind of like in my course, every week I assign a new piece in the course that I'm teaching. And I also give people the option in the method books simultaneously. They're more than welcome to. But this ends up being something like, I generally expect my students to practice like an absolute minimum of 30 minutes a day, but it's better to do an hour a day if you can, just because it's amazing how much more ground you can cover with that extra half an hour. And I find that dividing between the pieces that I assign individually that aren't in the method book and method book pieces, there's a lot of variety. So you're not doing the same thing over and over and over again every week, week after week. So the thing that I like to do with going through 2 method books in a year with my adult students is to prioritize breadth as opposed to perfection. So progress, not perfection, basically. If someone gets to the end of the Alfred book, I mean, there's probably at least 50 pieces in this book. It's not a small amount of music in a book like this, but I wouldn't expect my student to master all 50 pieces because that would end up taking twice the amount of time. If you wanted to go through a method book and do a really, really, really good job of pretty much every single piece, it's going to take you about a year. There's nothing wrong with that approach, and I've done that with my students before. But again, I don't know that the benefits of doing that are higher than the benefits of going through the material faster. Not mastering everything, but kind of making it to a grade 1 level by the end of the year. I feel like the benefits of the faster progress outweigh any benefits you get from perfecting so many pieces.